In some ways, Gregor Johann Mendel was a very typical monk. He was quiet and modest, quite content to either putter around behind the walls of his reclusive monastery or to administer to the needs of the townspeople. He had a sensitive nature and was especially disturbed by human pain and suffering. And he liked to teach. The children in the local high school, where he often substituted, found him to be kind and helpful, and he always tried to make his lessons interesting. Mendel had receding hair over a high forehead, he wore round spectacles, and he had a broad mouth that turned up at the corners, like the beginning of a smile. On the surface, he was living a conventional life of servitude to his church and community, but there was something mysterious about Brother Gregor. Next to one of the white stone walls of the monastery, there was a garden, perhaps 120 feet long and 20 feet wide, separated from the rest of the property by a hedge. In this garden, Mendel raised bees and bred mice, but most importantly, he grew peas. He grew lots of peas, all different sizes and varieties, good healthy peas that would have made delicious eating. But Gregor Mendel wasn't raising peas for food, he was raising them for answers. In this garden, on any spring day, there he would be, walking among the plants that he'd supported with poles and string, peering at them intently. There were hundreds of plants, some with purple blossoms and some with white, some tall, others short. Now and then he would stop and, with a pair of forceps, carefully pry apart an unopened blossom. Just as carefully, he would detach the part of the flower that bore the pollen. Then he would carry the pollen to another plant and dust it onto the stigma. Finally, he would wrap the second plant with a calico bag to prevent bees from carrying other pollen to it. That done, he might retire to his room to write his observations. In this little garden, with his numerous pea plants, Gregor Mendel looked nothing more than a studious priest with an unusual hobby. In fact, even when he died in 1884, that was the view his fellow monks and community still held of him. Not until the early 1900s would the world come to realize that Mendel was a great biological scientist who had discovered the principles of genetics and had laid the foundation for all future studies in that new and influential field. Mendel was born July 22, 1822, in Heisendorf, Austria, then a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, now a part of Czechoslovakia. He was christened Johann Mendel and took the name Gregor at the age of 25 when he joined the monastery. Mendel's parents were peasants who struggled hard to make a living off a small plot of land outside the village, which was set in the foothills of the Moravian Mountains. As a boy, he helped on the farm and attended the village school, which was free. On the farm, he developed a love for nature. In the school, he developed a passion for learning. The school was run by a pastor who had an interest in fruit growing and beekeeping. Interests he passed on to his students. He used the school garden to teach them his hobbies and to kindle their interest in botany. The teacher saw exceptional curiosity and talent in Mendel and encouraged his family to continue his education, not something they could easily do. The Mendels had barely enough money for clothing, much less for tuition and books. Nevertheless, they pinched and sacrificed even further so they could send Mendel to a high school in the neighboring town of Troppau, where he learned Latin, mathematics, and his favorite subject, science. Mendel studied hard, but he had so little money he wasn't able to eat properly, and eventually became ill from malnutrition. When he was recovered, he took up the study of philosophy at the Philosophical Institute in the city of Olmütz, trying to support himself by tutoring. But poverty and hunger continued to threaten his health and ability to study, until he finally wrote, "It is incumbent upon me to enter a profession in which I may be spared perpetual anxiety about a means of livelihood." To settle the matter, when he was 21, he entered the Augustinian monastery of St. Thomas in Brunn. From then on, he was Brother Gregor. In his 20s, Brother Gregor was a stocky man of medium height with clear blue eyes and curly brown hair. People found him to be friendly and patient, intellectual and quiet-spoken. Life in the monastery seemed perfectly designed to suit Mendel's interests and needs. He now had security, a sense of purpose, and the resources and time to pursue his intellectual interests. Most of the time he was required to study theology and the classics, but in his spare time he continued his studies in the natural sciences. Soon he began his own experiments. experiments that quietly and slowly led to the key to one of the greatest secrets of nature. When he was 25, Mendel was ordained as a Roman Catholic priest and served for a time as an assistant pastor, a post that didn't work out very well. It required him to come in close contact with human suffering and death, contact that was so distressing to him he became physically ill. Because of this, and because of his kindness and enthusiasm, the abbot of the monastery thought Mendel might make a good teacher instead. It was the responsibility of the Augustinians to supply teachers for the schools in Austria, so the abbot arranged to have Mendel teach mathematics and Greek at a high school in a nearby town. The abbot had been a good judge of character. Brother Gregor loved teaching, and his students were devoted to him. Unfortunately, his credentials allowed him to teach for only 1 year. So, when the year was up, Mendel decided to take an examination that would give him higher credentials. He studied on his own, whenever time allowed, but he was unable to prepare himself adequately and failed the exam. Ironically enough, his lowest grades were in biology and geology. Nevertheless, the examiner was so impressed with his overall knowledge and his earnestness that he encouraged the abbot to send Mendel to the University of Vienna, where he studied physics, botany, zoology, mathematics, and chemistry. He also attended lectures by the well-known physicist Christian Doppler, who developed a theory of sound waves known as the Doppler effect. When he returned to the monastery, he resumed his work at the high school as a substitute science teacher. He took the exam for higher credentials again, in fact twice more, and failed each time. Mendel, who in some ways seemed emotionally fragile, had a nervous breakdown studying for these exams and finally resigned himself to a future as a substitute teacher at the high school level. There were many who were glad he did. He was one of the most popular teachers at the school, with both faculty and students. His pupils loved to visit him at the monastery, where he would give them a tour around his garden, introduce them to his animals and his beehives, and show them his scientific instruments. Boys, all his students were boys, always responded to his serenity, his friendliness, and his transparent love and curiosity about nature. The libraries of both the monastery and the school contained important scientific books, especially on agriculture, horticulture, and botany, and Mendel spent many hours perusing all of them. He also bought himself new books in these fields as they were published. For the rest of his days, Gregor Mendel lived his dedicated and structured life, sometimes cloistered behind the monastery walls, sometimes emerging for active work in the community. It was a life that was deceptively obscure and simple, for within his mind were dancing some of the most complex questions and theories of science, and within his garden and diaries were appearing the brilliant answers that would later astound everyone. Mendel began his garden in 1856 when he was 34 years old. He kept the garden his whole life, but he spent 8 years of that life devoted to the study of peas. It wasn't the peas themselves that interested him so, but rather what they might reveal. The real focus of his study was one of the greatest mysteries of life, the mystery of heredity. When Mendel was growing up, people often commented on how he took after his father, and he wondered, why did he resemble his father? Why do some people resemble their father and some their mother? And why do some people, like a red-haired monk he knew, resemble neither of their parents but look instead like a grandparent? How are these matters determined, and what in nature decides them? These were the questions he brought to his peas, which seemed to him the easiest and most suitable plant for his garden. During his experiments, Mendel recorded and analyzed the data he took from mating, remating, and transmating over 21,000 plants. The answers, he knew, would apply not just to peas, but to all things born of seed, including human beings. He said, "It requires indeed some courage to undertake a labor of such far-reaching extent. This appears, however, to be the only right way by which we can finally reach the solution of a question, the importance of which cannot be overestimated in connection with the history of the evolution of organic forms." It was obvious to Mendel that if he didn't interfere with his plants, the tall plants and their seeds would produce more tall plants, and the short plants would produce more short plants. But he wondered what would happen if he crossed one tall plant and one short plant. There was only one way to find out. He took the pollen from the flower of a dwarf pea plant, no more than 2 feet high, and scattered it in the flower of a tall plant over 6 feet high. Then he waited and watched. To his amazement, every one of the offspring was tall. He recorded the results in his notebook, and he gave this trait, tallness, a label. He called it the dominant trait. Shortness he called a recessive trait. It was Mendel who first coined these terms, which were later applied to the term genes, a word that developed in 1909 from the Greek to give birth to. Today the phrase dominant and recessive genes has become a part of our common vocabulary. Now that he'd mixed tall and short, Mendel proceeded to the next step in his experiment. He waited for the second generation, the grandchildren, so to speak, to mature, and then he took their ripe seeds and planted them. Again he waited, and again he was amazed. 3 out of every 4 plants were tall. The remaining grandchild was short, but he didn't stop there. He went ahead with the next generation, the great-grandchildren. When he sowed the seeds of the third generation, the 3-to-1 group in which 3 had been tall and 1 short, a new rule popped up. The short plants produced only short children, but the tall plants produced along the 3-to-1 ratio, 3 talls and 1 short. Mendel planted generation after generation of his pea plants, and always the result was the same. Of every group of 4 offspring, 3 were tall and 1 was short. The short always bred short plants, 1 tall produced tall plants, and the remaining 2 talls bred a mixture of 3 talls to 1 short. It may sound confusing at first, but what it amounted to was a very simple mathematical formula as to what traits would be passed on through the generations, at least in the matter of size. Now Mendel moved on to other traits. In his next phase, the gardener in the black jacket and the white clerical collar divided up his garden into plots where he could experiment with different characteristics of the common pea. In one plot he was breeding for size. In another plot he was crossing a smooth pea with a wrinkled variety. In a third he was crossing green pods with yellow pods. There was the plot where some flowers grew on an axis and some were bunched at the top. And in a colorful plot in the corner were pea plants with purple flowers side by side with pea plants with white flowers. In all, Mendel was investigating 7 different traits of the pea plant, something no one had ever tried before with either plant or animal. He had ceased to be the ordinary gardener long ago, and he had ceased, too, to be the ordinary man. No matter what trait Mendel worked with, the results were always the same. Using his simple mathematical formula, he could predict which traits the descendants of an original pair of plants would inherit. Mendel wrote, "In the second and later generations of a hybrid, every possible combination of the parent characteristics occur, and each combination appears in a definite proportion of the individuals. A parent characteristic which is fully developed in the hybrid is said to be dominant. If it's absent, it's recessive." All along, Mendel suspected that his findings would apply to human heredity as well as plants, but he was a true scientist, and so he was cautious. He refrained from jumping to conclusions that he couldn't prove. By now it was 1865, the year Joseph Lister would use antiseptics for the first time in surgery, that Louis Pasteur would succeed in curing silkworm disease, thus saving the French silk industry, and the year Gregor Mendel had decided it was time to reveal his discoveries to the world. One cold winter evening he bundled his report into a satchel and trudged several miles to the high school where there was a meeting of the Natural Science Society of Brunn. There he read his findings aloud to an audience of 40 people, most of them professors of science. In his quiet voice he described his experiments and read off some statistics. 1 out of 4, purple and white. 3 out of 4 dominant. He condensed 8 years of work into 1 hour. But no one seemed very interested. Some even tried to repress yawns. When Mendel finished reading, there was not one comment, not one question. The meeting adjourned, and the members hustled out into the brisk air, where they began chatting about other topics discussed earlier in the evening. A paper containing one of the greatest scientific discoveries in history had been received with complete indifference. After his bland reception at the Natural Science Society, Mendel began to think about the idea that he was an amateur, not a professional, and that if he wanted to share his discoveries with the world, he would need the support and sponsorship of a well-known botanist. In the late 1860s, he therefore decided to send his paper to the nearest prominent expert, a Swiss botanist named Carl Nageli, who had been studying the division of plant cells. In spite of his proximity, Nageli was perhaps the worst choice Mendel could have made. He came to science with a sort of religious, mystical bias that had already caused him to reject much of Darwinism on the grounds that natural selection was too random and that evolution had to have some sort of inner push or force that drove it. Nageli was an old-fashioned botanist, the type that liked to engage in a lot of theory and speculation. The paper he received from this obscure monk in Austria was strictly rational and objective, lacked speculation of any kind, and was supported by hard mathematics that Nageli wasn't equipped to understand. The meticulous counting and ratios seemed pointless to him. When he dismissed it, almost with scorn, he delayed the development of genetics by a full generation. In consequence, he's ever since been known in his field chiefly for his failure to recognize the genius of Mendel rather than for any achievements he might have made. Nageli returned Mendel's paper to him with a few short, cold notes and a half-hearted offer to grow some of his seeds, an offer he never followed through on. Mendel sent Nageli a few more letters, none of which he answered, and when Nageli wrote his major work on evolution years later, he never once mentioned Mendel. For Gregor Mendel, a modest monk too aware of his amateur status, a man with a sensitive and sometimes fragile nature, the rejection by Nageli meant closure on his work and hopes. He abandoned his research and made only one more attempt to make his findings known, by publishing his article in a copy of the Transactions of the Brunn Natural Science Society. Although the article made its way to the major libraries of Europe and America, once again there was no response, but his work was at least on record, and that record would surface years later at precisely the right moment. These times were difficult ones for Mendel personally, and they were difficult ones for his homeland. The Prussians, under the leadership of Otto von Bismarck, were rising to power in Europe and had launched a war with Austria that lasted 7 weeks. The Austrians lost, and suddenly Mendel's city of Brunn was occupied by Prussian troops. Even without the rejection of Nageli, he was finding that his duties more and more called him out of his walled garden. 3 years after he read his paper to the Society of Natural Science, to the interest and praise of no one, and 2 years after he'd received that paper back from an indifferent Nageli, Gregor Mendel was elected abbot of his monastery by a unanimous vote of his fellow monks. It was the only triumph of his lifetime. As abbot, Brother Gregor had many administrative duties that left him little free time. These duties became even heavier when he decided to battle what he believed were discriminatory tax laws levied against the church by the Austrian government. And finally, as he became older and heavier, Mendel found it was difficult to do all the bending that was required to attend his peas properly. Seldom did he visit his garden anymore. Instead, he developed an interest in meteorology and kept precise records of the daily weather and its patterns. Mendel died January 6, 1884, at the age of 62, saddened that he'd never been able to share the work to which he'd so diligently and passionately dedicated himself. His friends and colleagues mourned the loss of a dedicated monk, an inspiring teacher, and a genial friend. They never dreamed that they also mourned the loss of one of the greatest men in science. It would be another generation before the importance of the discoveries of Gregor Mendel were brought into the light. There was a lot happening in the year 1900 as the new century dawned. Human speech was transmitted by radio waves for the first time. The element radon was discovered. In Paris, the New World's Fair opened. In Austria, Sigmund Freud released his revolutionary book, The Interpretation of Dreams. In America, the first 4,000 automobiles took to the roads. And in Holland, a botanist named Hugo de Vries sat in a library turning the pages of a scientific journal that was almost 50 years old, and ran across an article that made him stop in his tracks. De Vries, after years of intensive research, had worked out certain laws of heredity, but before publishing his findings, he was reviewing the literature to see if anything else existed on the subject. And there it was, an article entitled Experiments with Hybrid Plants, written by someone he'd never heard of named Gregor Mendel. The article described experiments in heredity Mendel conducted on pea plants in a monastery in Austria. To De Vries, the information it contained was extraordinary. It supported the same laws he'd discovered and answered urgent questions that had recently been raised in the minds of botanists the world over. It was incredible to him that Gregor Mendel and his work had gone unnoticed. That same year, two other botanists, Erich Czermak in Vienna and Karl Correns in Munich, discovered the same paper and had the same reaction De Vries did. All three scientists, independently and unknown to each other, had been working on the issue of heredity, and all three had reached similar conclusions about the laws of heredity. Now each had discovered that Gregor Mendel had preceded them by half a century. The field of science is known for its competition, jealousy, and bitter feuds over credit and recognition. But it's one of the most inspiring chapters in its history that not one of the three men tried to claim the credit for ideas they had worked hard on themselves and which would have brought them great fame. Instead, they each published papers crediting Mendel as the discoverer of heredity and citing their own work only as confirmation of what Mendel had already proven. Thus, with the integrity of the true scientist, they brought him to the attention of other scientists the world over, and from then on the laws of heredity were known as Mendel's Law. 16 years after his death, Brother Gregor finally had the acclaim he so richly deserved. In his article, Mendel described three theories or laws of heredity. The first law is the principle of segregation. This law says that during the formation of the sex cells, the egg and the sperm, paired factors segregate or separate. Thus, a sperm or egg may contain either a tallness factor or a shortness factor, but not both. The second law is called the principle of independent assortment. This means simply that characteristics are inherited independently of each other. For instance, the tallness factor may be inherited with any other factor, dominant or recessive. The third and last Mendel law is the law of dominance. It states that each characteristic is determined by the interaction of two hereditary elements, now called genes, one from each parent. He found that one factor of the pair always dominated, as with tallness over shortness. Within a year after the discovery of his article, Mendel's discoveries were being taught in universities. Soon scientists found that his laws applied to humans as well as plants and animals, something Mendel had always believed but could not prove. Blue and brown eyes, blonde or black hair, height, color blindness, all of these followed his laws, as did certain inherited diseases like hemophilia, an inherited tendency toward uncontrollable bleeding. When his laws were applied to food production, scientists found they could create hybrids of certain crops, such as corn, that gave a higher yield per acre and were more resistant to disease and drought. When the work of Mendel was put to practical use in fields like medicine and agriculture, the benefits were enormous. Later, it was also applied to biochemistry, physiology, and social science. Gregor Mendel's discoveries were also of immense importance to the evolution theories of Charles Darwin, which had been released 2 years after Mendel started his work in the pea garden. Mendel had read Darwin's book, Origin of the Species. He even made notations in the margin. But it seems he never realized how his own work contributed to and supported Darwin's. Although many scientists found the theory of natural selection and evolution interesting, they saw a problem with it. There was no explanation for how it happened. Clearly, a cheetah with the swiftest set of legs would be more likely to survive, and clearly the polar seal with the thickest fur would be most likely to survive. But how do these animals come by their equipment in the first place? What in the processes of nature brings it about? It was Mendel's work that established the mechanism for natural selection. First of all, he showed that certain characteristics tend to be inherited more often than others. If two varieties of plants or animals are mated, and if one variety has a particularly strong characteristic, all the offspring, or hybrids as they're called in botany, will have that trait. However, when these offspring mated, the number of offspring or grandchildren that have that characteristic can be predicted by a specific numerical ratio. Mendel also discovered that both male and female parents contributed on an equal basis, a factor that governed each particular trait. The pair of factors, which we now call genes, didn't blend, but remained distinct. Darwin had said that each generation of a species would have natural variations, and that nature seized upon these variations to preserve the good and doom the bad. This action of natural selection was slow, however. It took countless years and generations. People had wondered, what if, in the meantime, through random mating, the variations or differences melted into intermediacy or some middle state? How would natural selection exert its effect? It was Mendel who discovered that varying characteristics don't blend into an intermediary state. They always remain distinct. Therefore, natural selection, even though it was slow, could still affect variation. What Gregor Mendel discovered in his quiet garden in a monastery after 8 years of research will affect human progress for centuries to come. Mendel discovered the principle of the inheritance of characteristics through the combination of genes from parent cells. He produced the first accurate and scientific explanation for hybridization. His conclusions formed the basic laws of genetics, known today as Mendelism, and they had a notable influence in plant and animal breeding. Mendel's law, along with Darwin's theory of evolution, became one of the great biological discoveries of the 19th century and led to a new branch of biology that came to be known as genetics. Today, knowledge and influence of genetics is still in its infancy. Its implications have become increasingly controversial and even alarming as people question the ethics and uses of controlled heredity. As always, with a new set of answers has come a new set of questions. One can't help but wonder what he would think, the modest and dedicated monk who had a fascination with peas and their offspring, and who thought his work had been for nothing.